Have you ever noticed how life doesn't always reward the honest, the kind, or the patient? Sometimes it feels like the cunning, the shrewd, or even the selfish get ahead. And that tension, that uncomfortable truth about human nature, is at the very heart of Jacob's story. His life is not a polished tale of perfection, but a messy journey filled with family drama, deception, rivalry, and, ultimately, redemption. And here's the thing, through it all, we see how God works with imperfect people to fulfill His perfect plan. Let's dive in. A promise delayed. Our story begins with Isaac and Rebekah, a couple carrying a heavy burden: infertility. For 20 long years, Rebekah couldn't conceive. In ancient times, being barren wasn't just emotionally devastating, it was seen as a curse. Imagine the strain that must have put on their marriage. Isaac had grown up knowing God had promised his father Abraham that their descendants would be as countless as the stars. And yet here he was, praying year after year, waiting with no answer in sight. I think of couples today who struggle with infertility. I once spoke with a friend who shared the quiet heartbreak of watching others announce pregnancies, while she and her husband carried the silent weight of, what if it never happens for us? That's the world Isaac and Rebekah lived in, except magnified, because God's covenant promises seemed to hang in the balance. Finally, after 20 decades of waiting, God answered Isaac's prayers. But with the blessing came struggle. Rebekah's pregnancy was so turbulent that she asked God directly, "Why is this happening to me?" And the answer was startling. Inside her womb were not just twins, but two nations. God told her that one would be stronger than the other and that the older would serve the younger. This wasn't just about family dynamics, it was prophecy that flipped cultural norms on their head. In their world, the firstborn always held the power, but God was making it clear. He doesn't always follow human rules. Twins, but worlds apart. When the twins were born, the contrast was obvious. Esau came out first, red, hairy, rugged-looking, almost like a wild man in miniature. Then came Jacob, clutching his brother's heel as if trying to pull him back into the womb. Even his name, Jacob, meant heel grabber, a word that also carried the sense of supplanter or schemer. It was a prophetic snapshot of their destinies. The boys grew into very different men. Esau was the outdoorsman, the hunter, the kind of guy who today might spend every weekend fishing, hiking, or grilling venison over a campfire. Jacob, on the other hand, was quiet, more at home in the tents. Think of them as the kind who preferred reading, cooking, or managing household affairs. And here's where favoritism crept in. Isaac, drawn to Esau's gamey meals, loved Esau more. Rebekah, sensing God's prophecy and perhaps seeing something in Jacob's temperament, loved Jacob. Parents, let's be honest, favoritism is poison in a family. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've lived it. A sibling who always seemed to get the praise while you were overlooked. That division sows seeds that eventually grow into conflict, and in Jacob's family, it set the stage for disaster. The stew that changed everything. One day, Esau returned from hunting exhausted and starving. He found Jacob cooking a pot of lentil stew. Now, anyone who's come home from a long day knows how hunger clouds judgment. Esau begged for a bowl, but Jacob, sharp and calculating, saw his chance. He demanded, "Sell me your birthright first." Now, the birthright wasn't just about property, it meant spiritual leadership, inheritance, and being the carrier of God's covenant promises. But Esau, living only in the moment, swore it away for a bowl of stew. It's almost laughable in its short-sightedness, trading something eternal for something that would be gone in a few hours. I remember once reading about a businessman who in the 90s sold his share in a tech startup for just a few $1,000s because he needed quick cash. That startup? Amazon. Today, that same share would have been worth billions. Like Esau, he traded the future for immediate relief. Esau's decision revealed his character: impulsive, reckless, unable to see beyond his appetite. Jacob, on the other hand, displayed shrewdness. Some might call it manipulative, some might call it strategic. Either way, both choices shaped the destinies of nations. Deception in the family. Years later, as Isaac grew old and nearly blind, he prepared to bless Esau. This blessing wasn't just a father's wish, it was a prophetic act, a formal passing of destiny from one generation to the next. But Rebekah, remembering God's prophecy, hatched a plan. She told Jacob to disguise himself as Esau and claim the blessing. Picture the scene: Jacob hesitating, worried not about morality but about getting caught. Rebekah insisting, "Let the curse fall on me." Goatskins strapped to Jacob's arms to mimic Esau's hairiness, the smell of Esau's clothes. It's almost like a scene from a suspense film. Isaac, suspicious, asked, "Who are you, my son?" And Jacob lied, "I am Esau." Isaac touched him, confused. The voice was Jacob's, but the skin felt like Esau's. Eventually, Isaac gave in and spoke the blessing over Jacob, words of prosperity, power, and dominion. Moments later, Esau returned with his game, only to realize what had happened. The heartbreak in his cry still echoes today. "Bless me, me too, my father." But it was too late. Isaac's trembling revealed his shock, but also his recognition that God's will had been done, however deceitfully. Esau wept, begged, pleaded for a blessing, and was given a lesser one, a life of struggle, but with a promise that one day he would break free. And from that moment, Esau's heart hardened with hatred. He vowed to kill his brother. Lessons from the early years. When we zoom out, these early chapters of Jacob's life are full of messy human choices, favoritism, manipulation, impulsiveness, lies, and rivalry. Yet through all this dysfunction, God's purposes were unfolding. And maybe that's the point. Jacob's story isn't about a flawless saint. It's about how God weaves redemption through flawed people. For anyone who's ever felt disqualified by their past mistakes or messy family background, Jacob's story says God can still use you. So here's my takeaway from this first part. Don't underestimate the power of choices. Esau's reckless hunger cost him everything. Jacob's deceit gave him a blessing, but also a life on the run. Our decisions, whether driven by appetite, fear, or faith, shape not only our futures, but often the lives of those around us. Running from home. After stealing Esau's blessing, Jacob's life took a sharp turn. His brother's vow to kill him wasn't just empty words. Rebekah, fearing for her younger son's life, urged Jacob to flee to her brother Laban in Haran. So Jacob, the man who had grasped for blessing through deceit, now found himself alone, afraid, and on the run. Imagine that moment. Jacob had gotten what he wanted, the blessing. But instead of joy, he was filled with fear. Instead of prosperity, he had nothing but a staff in his hand. That's the paradox of life sometimes. You can achieve your goals the wrong way and still end up empty. I'm reminded of a story I once heard about a Wall Street trader in the early 2000s. He manipulated deals to climb the corporate ladder, raking in wealth and prestige. But when the truth came out, he lost it all. His career, his family, even his freedom. Like Jacob, he got what he thought he wanted, but discovered it was hollow. The dream at Bethel. On his way to Haran, Jacob stopped to rest, using a stone as his pillow. That night, he had a dream, a vision of a ladder stretching from earth to heaven. with angels ascending and descending. At the top stood God, reaffirming the covenant he had given to Abraham and Isaac. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. All nations will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. For Jacob, this was a turning point. Up until now, his relationship with God had been secondhand. He'd heard the stories from his father and grandfather, but this was the first time God spoke directly to him. When Jacob woke up, he declared, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He set up the stone as a pillar, naming the place Bethel, which means house of God. He even made a vow. If God protected him, he would devote himself fully to him. This moment reminds me of something I heard from a young man who grew up in church but never felt connected to God. One night, while traveling alone, he pulled over his car on a quiet road and prayed for the first time from his heart. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't inherited, it was raw and personal. That's when faith became real to him. Jacob was having that kind of moment. A trickster meets his match. When Jacob finally reached Haran, he met Rachel, Laban's daughter, at a well. It was love at first sight. Jacob agreed to work 7 years for Laban in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. The Bible says those years felt like only a few days to him because of his love for her. That's the kind of poetic line that makes us smile. But Jacob, the trickster, soon discovered what it felt like to be deceived. On the wedding night, Laban secretly gave him Leah, Rachel's older sister, instead of Rachel. Only in the morning did Jacob realize the switch. Can you imagine that shock? The trickster had been tricked. Laban excused himself with cultural norms. The older daughter must be married first. If Jacob wanted Rachel too, he'd need to work another 7 years. Jacob agreed. The deceiver became the deceived. There's a certain poetic justice here. Jacob, who once fooled his father with disguises, now fell victim to Laban's trickery. And isn't that how life often works? The very flaws we exploit in others often come back to test us. I knew a man who vowed never to repeat the mistakes of his father. His dad had been absent, chasing money instead of family. But years later, he realized he had fallen into that same trap, working endless hours while missing his children's milestones. Jacob was living that same cycle of brokenness, passing down the very patterns he had grown up with, warsailing with prosperity. Despite the dysfunction, Jacob prospered under Laban. Through clever breeding practices and God's blessing, he became wealthy in flocks and herds. But success only fueled tension with Laban and his sons. They accused Jacob of stealing their inheritance, and Jacob knew it was time to leave. So he packed up his family and flocks in secret and fled. Laban pursued him, but God intervened in a dream, warning Laban not to harm Jacob. The two men eventually made a covenant of peace, but it was clear Jacob could no longer hide from his past. He was heading back home, and with that return came the looming question, what about Esau? Preparing for Esau. Jacob sent messengers ahead to Esau with gifts, hoping to soften his brother's anger. When the messengers returned, they brought chilling news. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob panicked. He divided his family and possessions into 2 groups, thinking if Esau attacked one, the other might escape. Then he prayed, really prayed, acknowledging his unworthiness and begging God for deliverance. This was a different Jacob from the one who had schemed and grasped for blessings years earlier. Here was a man humbled, desperate, finally relying on God instead of his own cleverness. Wrestling with God. The night before meeting Esau, Jacob was left alone. And in that solitude, he encountered a mysterious man who wrestled with him until daybreak. This wasn't just a physical struggle, it was a spiritual one. When the man saw he could not overpower Jacob, he touched Jacob's hip,
wrenching it out of socket. Still, Jacob clung to him, saying, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel," the man declared, "because you have struggled with God and with humans and overcome." Jacob limped away from that encounter, forever marked by the struggle. He had wrestled with God and lived, but he was never the same. Lessons from the middle journey. In this stage of Jacob's life, we see a man shaped by hardship, trickery, and rivalry, but also softened by divine encounters. His story reminds us that struggles, whether with people or with God, are not meant to break us, but to transform us. I think of a woman I met who battled cancer for years. She told me, "I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade it, because through it, I've come to know God in ways I never could have otherwise." Jacob's limp became a daily reminder of dependence, just as her scars became symbols of faith. Here's the takeaway. Our struggles can become the very place where God renames us, reshapes us, and prepares us for reconciliation.
The reunion with Esau. Morning came. Jacob, limping from his wrestle with God, looked up and saw Esau approaching with his 400 men. Can you imagine the fear in that moment? Decades of guilt, dread, and unresolved conflict all converged here. Jacob went ahead of his family, bowing 7 times as he approached his brother. But then, something unexpected happened. Esau ran to meet Jacob, embraced him, and wept. The bitterness of the past melted into forgiveness. The brother who once vowed to kill him now welcomed him home. This reunion is one of the most moving moments in the Bible. It reminds us that even the deepest wounds can be healed, not because we earn forgiveness, but because reconciliation is possible when God softens hearts. I once read about 2 veterans who fought on opposite sides of a civil war. For decades, they carried hatred and pain. But years later, they met, embraced, and cried together. Like Jacob and Esau, their shared humanity outweighed the scars of the past. After reconciling with Esau, Jacob journeyed on and settled in Canaan. But his life was far from peaceful. His household was fractured with jealousy and betrayal. Leah's sons resented Rachel's son Joseph, and this tension would eventually lead to Joseph being sold into slavery. Jacob's favoritism toward Joseph echoed the very pattern of favoritism that had haunted his own childhood. The cycle continued, showing us how unresolved wounds often pass from one generation to the next. This is where Jacob's story shifts from being just about him. It becomes the foundation for the tribes of Israel. His 12 sons, born out of rivalry and strife, would become the 12 tribes, carrying both the blessing and the brokenness of their father's legacy. The God of Bethel still with him. As Jacob grew older, he returned to Bethel, the place where he had first seen the ladder to heaven. There, God once again appeared to him, reaffirming the covenant. Jacob built an altar, reminding himself and his family of God's faithfulness. Even after years of mistakes, God's promise stood firm. That's the beauty of Jacob's story. It's not about his perfection, but about God's persistence. Think about that. Jacob tricked, deceived, fled, fought, and limped his way through life. And yet God never abandoned him. If that's true for Jacob, it's true for us too. Jacob eventually moved to Egypt, reunited with his long-lost son Joseph. In his old age, he blessed Pharaoh, a striking moment where the once deceiver now stood as a patriarch of faith. Before his death, Jacob gathered his sons and spoke prophetic blessings over them, words that would shape the destiny of Israel. Then, with his final breath, Jacob requested to be buried in the land of his fathers. His story began with running, wrestling, and deceit, but it ended in faith, rooted in God's promise.
the larger meaning of Jacob's story. So what do we take from Jacob's journey? 3 truths stand out. 1. God works through imperfection. Jacob wasn't a flawless hero, he was deeply human. His flaws make his story relatable, and they remind us that God's plans aren't derailed by our failures. 2. Struggles transform us. Jacob's limp wasn't a mark of weakness, it was a reminder of his encounter with God. Sometimes the scars we carry are evidence of battles that shaped us into who we were meant to be. 3. Forgiveness redeems. The reunion with Esau is a timeless reminder that reconciliation is possible. Even decades of hostility can end in peace when God intervenes. A modern reflection. I recently heard of a father and son who hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years. Pride and hurt had built a wall between them. But when the father grew ill, the son reached out. They reconnected, wept, and spent the father's final days together in peace. That's Jacob and Esau's story playing out in real life. It shows us that reconciliation is never too late, and forgiveness is never wasted. Here's what I want to leave with you. Jacob's life is a mirror of our own. We wrestle with fears, relationships, and even with God Himself. But those struggles don't define us, they refine us. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, meaning one who wrestles with God. That's a name of identity and destiny. And in a way, we all carry that name, because life with God isn't about having every answer, it's about clinging to Him even when we don't. So if you feel like Jacob, flawed, tired, limping from life's battles, remember this: the God of Jacob is also your God. He doesn't abandon, He doesn't forget, and He can redeem even the messiest of stories.